Trying new things can be daunting, even in the highly accessible YouTube, TikTok, Instagram age. I know for me, because the info is so readily available, if I'm not researching before doing a new task, it can feel like I'm probably doing it wrong, which can then convince me to not even try in the first place if I'm not willing to put in that time to research. Today we're going to try some new things on this beautiful model from Neko Galaxy, the sponsor for this video, without looking up specific guides. I'll only use the info readily available to me to lower the barrier of entry for myself. Hopefully some of the ideas presented here will empower you hobbyists to tackle learning a new skill. Today, for the first time, I'm going to paint East Asian skin tones, do leopard print clothing, and scratch build a hoverboard. Let's get into it. Starting off with the skin tones, my first thought was to paint a test model from the game Bushido. I didn't research anything, I just jumped in with preconceived notions, which were that these types of skin tones have more yellow in them. I painted this figure up on stream, and you can watch that VOD on the Miniac's backlog channel linked below. I save all my VODs for my live streams on that channel if you ever miss any. If you want to catch some painting streams, I'm live at 1 p.m. CST on Tuesdays, link in the description. I think my initial attempt here was a bit too exaggerated. If I can look at the model and feel the yellow, I think that means I overdid it. Maybe it should only look yellow when compared to other ethnicities, which gave me an idea. Here's a picture of a Japanese woman, here's a picture of an American woman, at least according to Google Images. Now there are some pretty obvious visual differences that I can't see because my printer ink ran out of color. I'm sorry. So let's take these images into software and process them a bit further to really drill down what's going on. I'm gonna select 3 zones on each face that represent the highlight, midtone, and shadow. I'll then apply an average blur to each zone to make sure I'm not hitting any weird super bright spots or dark spots. Comparing the colors, you can clearly see that in the Caucasian subject, there's just a heck of a lot more red. If you look at the info panel in Photoshop, you can see that there is a bit more yellow in each swatch as well. However, there isn't so much that you noticed it in a side-by-side comparison. What's more striking is how much red the Japanese subject is missing, very desaturated. Trying to encapsulate all of East Asia in one skin tone is literally impossible, so we narrowed the scope. This is what I want my Neko Galaxy figure to look like. Now, something else that's probably contributing to our research here is that Japan and also Korea have very strong beauty cultures. And because of that, the people can tend to look almost porcelain-like. And I mean that in the best way possible. Their skin is very fair, and they have absolutely no blemishes, and the features are all very softly defined, even more so than normal. For my Bushido example, I tried to mix the skin tone from primaries, and for my new attempt, I'm going to use a color that's pretty close to what I already need, but I'm going to mix in some blue and some yellow in small amounts, intentionally avoiding red. I'm also going to mix in some white and black, effectively gray, to desaturate the skin tone, trying to achieve that fair foundation makeup look. I began by base coating the face with various shades of this flesh tone, targeting shadowed areas with darker colors and highlighted areas with lighter colors. While doing that, I also diluted versions of those same colors to begin blending in between those areas. For my highlights, I mixed in a warm white color to desaturate the skin further, but not as much as pure white would do. I further built up my highlights in areas like the center of the forehead. Keeping the edges near the hairline dark not only is realistic because Rosie has large bangs that would block some light, but it also makes her forehead appear smaller, which is a technique that makeup artists use. I felt like it made sense to highlight and shade the model using those techniques considering what we're trying to mimic. This is also why I contoured both the nose and also the cheek area. Having shading next to the nose and cheek adjusts their shape to something more preferable. This is an example of how you can create volumes on a model without needing the sculpt to do it for you. Same thing with makeup. With the eyes, I followed my typical procedure of filling it in with dark red, covering up 90% of that with an off-white color, and then painting the pupils. This time I used a fun blue color as I planned to paint the hair the same color. For the iris, instead of using black, I used a darker blue color. This helps not only create a more realistic eye, but it also avoids the inevitable coke addict vibe your model gets when you put a tiny black dot in the middle of their eye. I then added a specular highlight to make the eye feel nice and glossy. As far as additional makeup goes, I glazed some pink into the cheeks, some dark purple around the eyebrows for some eyeshadow, and also painted the lips in a somewhat bizarre way. Being inspired by geishas, I painted the top lip in only a stripe on the bottom with a neutral lipstick color. In hindsight, I should have painted her lips a fun color like blue or green to really lean into the sci-fi nature of the model. It would also make the lipstick effect that I'm going for here more obvious. Shout out to my patrons for that suggestion. With the face looking how I want it to look, one of my last steps was to glaze a very small amount of yellow into the highlighted areas. I find that with glazing, it's much simpler to introduce subtlety. If I want to have the skin look somewhat yellow, I'd rather paint the skin normally and glaze yellow where it makes sense as opposed to mixing yellow into my original base coat in layers. Both approaches are totally valid, but whenever I mix paint, I tend to overshoot the mark. After a lot of futzing around, this is where my face ended up. And apparently you can see all my mistakes now, enlarged in glorious 4K. Awesome. At the moment, I'm not super convinced that this character is Japanese, and that's to be expected. It's my second time taking a stab at a new subject. You and I should both expect to fail. At this point, I'm happy to move on. It's important to just be done painting a model at some point and move on to newer and exciting creative projects, like that Cheetah Print. Oh my lord! It's time to take my learning lessons with me, but what did I actually learn? If we compare the picture with the model, we can begin to notice some things. Notice how the nose of the Japanese woman flows into her cheek. There is no shadow there, whereas with my attempt, I painted the nose following a makeup technique referred to as the snatched nose. This process creates a more defined facial feature. Also, maybe I'm pushing the contrast too much in general. We did say earlier how the features are very softly defined, even more so than normal. So now you've seen the full loop. Low stress attempt with minimal to no research, backup and do some research narrowing the field of options so that our final target is very specific, a second more serious attempt using that research, and then a final retrospective on what to do next time. It's also important to note that you can take any of these steps and spin them to be more you. You don't have to be a nerd like me and analyze skin tones in Photoshop, so you can do whatever you want that's more accessible and more natural. By the way, if you want to see more painting footage of this miniature with my narration that didn't necessarily fit the purpose of this video, I make a supercut of all the painting footage for my patrons, and I've done quite a few of those in the past, so you get access to all of them when you sign up for the Dark Wizard tier on my Patreon. Alright, next up we'll do the Cheetah Print. Before that, let's hear a brief word from our sponsor. Neko Galaxy is a boutique display model company that features strong female characters in a cyberpunk setting. The concept follows a semi-realistic anime aesthetic and absolutely drips with sci-fi goodness. The casting quality on these figures is nothing short of glorious with fairly minimal cleanup and gap filling. Neko Galaxy has been in the game selling models since 2016, and they work with amazing concept artists to envision their worlds, such as Deathburger, Garleria, or Sergei Broza, the lead concept artist for Borderlands. A great model starts with a great concept, and I can see that Neko Galaxy invests in that crucial step of model design. All of their models are unashamedly what they are. What I mean by that is they're not trying to please anyone necessarily. They have a vision for a model they want to make and they execute on it, no holds barred, and I love that about this company. They even do cool things like two of the models in the range share a display base, so when joined together, they form a diorama, but they can also be painted separately. If you want thoughtfully designed, strong female sci-fi characters, there is no competitor in my eyes. Neko Galaxy is also offering the Miniac community 15% off their whole order with the coupon code MINIAC15 when shopping on their web store, linked down below. If you want to check out more of what they have going on to see what new designs are on the horizon, follow them on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you to Neko Galaxy for sponsoring this episode. Make sure to check out the web store and pick up one of these gorgeous designs with the 15% off coupon. All right, back to painting Rosie. Okay, step number one is probably obvious, but I'm going to look at some Cheetah Print and make some basic observations. There are often two colors, a somewhat darker version of the main color, and it's surrounded by an almost black or dark brown ring that is sometimes fully enclosed or sometimes not. There are often little dots of just dark on the print as well, with no inner colored core. Cool, let's mix it up a bit. I'm going to practice on some paper with some wacky colors to see what I like before I just sling paint on my nice model. This also gives me a shot to try out the Cheetah Print to see if my basic observations were enough or if there was something important that I missed. I'm glad I did this step because I found a color combination that I liked, but I also learned something. A good brush has a sharp tip and is capable of doing very precise and angular edges, but it can be hard to do nice soft curves, especially on a small little pattern like this. A really easy hack to better replicate the print I'm going for was to effectively paint with a small blob on the end of my paintbrush. The blob of paint removed the sharp accuracy of the tip, but not so much that it made it difficult to paint my pattern. I just rounded everything out nicely. Lastly, I was struggling with the idea of adding little spots of blue that had no pink inside them, like we previously observed on the Cheetah Print. I felt like I was cramming these little blue dots in between my pattern that I was already happy with, spacing-wise, so it made the design feel cramped. The solution to this was really simple. I painted the blue spots on my fabric first, and then worked the rest of the pattern around it, and thus small element was added from the get-go. Also, it's incredibly important to wear a two-piece Cheetah Print suit while painting Cheetah Print. This will ensure that your vibrations match the creative energy you're trying to impart on your art, or something. Also, you'll look pretty cool while doing it, if I do say so myself. Now, a good way to think of this pattern is that it's essentially a base coat. We still have to highlight and shade this thing like we would any other solid color. But how do we do that? First, before I even did the pattern, I painted the underlying color zenithly, in this case a nice cotton candy color. This will help assist our later efforts. Next, with our pattern complete, I'm going to glaze a dark purple color toward the areas where it would be dark. I find that it's easy to glaze dark colors with a brush. If you need any help with glazing, check out my video linked in the top right hand corner of the screen and in the description below. Lastly, I airbrush on a heavily diluted white ink where there would be highlights. This might seem a little crazy, but I don't care about overspray in this instance because any of the overspray onto the skin of the hip or of the breasts will just be highlight that would naturally occur in those parts anyways. To clean it up and make it not look like overspray, a simple thin recessed shade to divide those two design elements, skin and cloth, suddenly makes what could look like an overspray mistake an intentional highlight on both parts. Easy. You don't necessarily need an airbrush for this step, but I find it difficult to glaze bright colors, especially white. Again, a pretty similar process when compared to our skin tone experiments. I did some research, I did a test, and then I went for it. While I was painting, I was adjusting the freehand in case it was looking too sharp and angular and not soft and blobby enough. But for the most part, it was actually pretty simple with the approach and tips I used here, so give it a shot. Lastly, let's scratch build a hoverboard. The first and most obvious solution to this problem would be a tech deck. I picked one up and unfortunately it wasn't really the right size for a 75mm model. Kind of too big. So how do we get the right size?
Welcome to math class, bitches! You thought you weren't gonna use these skills you learned in high school? Well, think again!
We're painting a 75mm model today, but it's important to actually measure the model to see what its actual size is, instead of assuming that every single manufacturer is mathematically precise. The model in question measures about 90mm head to toe. Now, when determining a scale, which is how we're going to figure out the size of our hoverboard, the industry uses a 6-foot-tall person as a practice. 6 feet tall in millimeters is 1,828. With these two numbers, we have a ratio. And if we divide down to the lowest common denominator, we get something close to 1/20. What this means for us is in our 90mm world, everything is about 20 times smaller. Now, all we got to do is figure out the size of a typical skateboard, convert it to millimeter, divide by 20, and bada bing, bada boom, math. Or you could just say, screw the math and eyeball it because Rosie has this really weird wide stance and it wouldn't work out anyways, and that's what I did. I started a metric ruler in my model's feet and pose and came up with some numbers that worked for me, but your mileage may vary, and this method is totally valid to figure out the size of door frames and any number of things in a scale world. Next, with those dimensions, I created a simple rounded rectangle in Adobe Illustrator and cut it out on my vinyl cutter with very thin sheets of polystyrene. My plan was to pretend like I was laminating hardwood. I did this by taking the trucks off my tech deck and rubber banding the pieces of polystyrene to the tech deck, and then with some heat applied, the plastic melted and cooled to the form of the skateboard's subtle bends, which would otherwise be pretty challenging to mimic. The theory and practice here is that it's easier to bend and shape many thin pieces of a material and glue them together afterwards as opposed to trying to bend a thicker piece from the beginning. Because my skateboard was smaller than the tech deck, the curves and bends didn't fully transfer to the plastic, so I did some more bending with a rounded tool and a hairdryer, in this case the handle of my X-Acto. Honestly, I ended up just using one thin sheet of polystyrene, so my bent lamination idea was kind of a waste of time. I bulked up the width of the hoverboard by supergluing on some 220 grit sandpaper to act as grip tape, and I cut nice and close around the edge of the paper. Before doing any painting, I located the position that I wanted my model to be in with a pin and some paint, and then drilled that hole. I stole some sci-fi grapes from a sad and lonely mech kit to sci-fi it up a bit, and then primed and gave it a simple paint job with a bit of dry brushing. I used a cool gray for the grip tape. Lastly, I have so many cool stencils, and I thought a nice, big, flat hoverboard would be perfect for one. I grabbed a varying hexagonal pattern and sprayed on a light green to dark green gradient. Using the green that I also used on the jacket earlier helped tie it more into the scheme. Lastly, we need to figure out how to mount this figure so she can stand up by herself. I grabbed a clear piece of acrylic rod and sawed it down to size and also did a bit of an angle on one end. I'll explain why I did that in a bit. Then I 3D sculpted a flight stand in Fusion 360 that would receive my clear acrylic rod and prepped it for painting. If you're someone who struggles with 3D design software like myself, Fusion 360 is a great option if you're looking for making non-organic shapes. I then scored the underside of the board and the top of the acrylic rod after fitting it in with my flight stand and glued it down with some 2-part epoxy for strength and super glue to hold it in place while the epoxy dried. I only pressure fitted the rod into the flight stand base so at any time I can remove it and add it to a more thematically appropriate base if I wanted to. Now it should be kind of obvious why I cut the rod at a slight angle. Rosie has an awkwardly positioned head in that she's looking downward quite a bit. I like my model's faces to be easily visible, so angling the model upward makes that more possible. Also, now it feels like she's doing a sick hoverboard manual, which is always a bonus. And that should finish up Rosie from Necro Galaxy. Hopefully me sharing my process for how I tackle a new subject inspires and encourages you to give it a shot. You don't always need an exact guide to achieve something new. More often than not, you can learn with the tools and resources available to you. While painting this model, I think I realized something I really enjoy about miniature painting. Creatively, I think I have ADHD. I don't like doing the same thing over and over again, which is why I'm always changing up the format of my videos, the subject matter, and more. Fortunately for me, I can pick and choose from tons of different scales and subjects in the models I paint, and that helps me stay interested. I got to use a ton of pastel colors, paint wacky patterns, scratch both hoverboards, paint Hello Kitty logos, and paint what seems like Balenciaga sneakers. It's kind of like I get to experience the world of high fashion cyberpunk without needing to play a video game, watch a movie, start a show, or invest in a skirmish war game with a similar aesthetic. I get to be in the creative driver's seat while making the exact experience for myself that I want, and I love that about display models. They give me the creative freedom to explore parts of the world with just a single model, and then I'm done. In and out. You know what else allows me to do my job the way I want? My patrons. I honestly can't say enough nice things about my patrons. They represent a huge portion of consistent income on my channel, and they're just endlessly patient with me. I feel like lately I've really hit a slump in terms of productivity and motivation. But despite that, my patrons are still there, patiently waiting, still supporting. It's a really humbling experience, if I'm being quite honest. As a patron, you get access to my Discord server where you and I can hang out and chat any day of the week about my miniature painting projects, or anything else. There's an ongoing points-based system that awards you for painting miniatures, and we keep track of a leaderboard in the system to see who has the most points. There are ongoing quarterly challenges to get you more points, but also kind of spice up your hobby a little bit. You get access to these videos a little bit earlier than everyone else, and also you get to see those supercut versions of the videos like I mentioned previously. Thank you again so much to my patrons who continue to support me despite me doing weird and wacky stuff and not being the most reliable person, which pains me to say, but is honestly true. It means a lot. That'll do it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. I'll link some more videos at the end of this one that are similar in case you enjoyed this one. If you want to support the channel, Patreon's a great option. But also another great option is buying the tools that I recommend down in the description below with my Amazon affiliate links. Buying stuff off my merch store at miniac.co, like a cool cutting mat or a cool model like the Duchess. I also make a digital course along with that figure that you can follow so you can get a result similar to the box art. Subscribe or die! But most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!